Okay, I think that means I can go. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jenna Crucial, a proud Women's Affinity Alliance member, a member of Tempo, and co-vice chair of Tempo's Women Affinity Alliance Committee. On behalf of the full committee, thank you all for joining for today's session. I'm an assurance partner with BDO, where I have over a decade of experience in leading within our affinity group, which we call Women's Inclusion. BDO is proud to be a sponsor of Tempo's Women Affinity Alliance. Before we dive in, I'd like to thank our other corporate sponsors and partners that are listed on this screen. The Women's Affinity Alliance could not offer the events and resources that we do without the generous support of all of these partners. So thank you. If your organization is not currently involved in Tempo Women Affinity Alliance and would like to be or learn more about it, please reach out to the Tempo office. They'd be happy to answer any questions and get you plugged in. And we also offer individual memberships within WAY as well. For those of you who are attending your first Women's Affinity Alliance program, welcome. A little background to those that might not be familiar. It was founded in 2011 as a major initiative of the Tempo organization. WAY has its own membership made up of corporate partners and individual members, which can include Tempo members, emerging women leaders members, and other ERG leaders in the area. WAY was founded with a mission to connect ERG leaders and provide them with networking opportunities and access to share best practices, enabling them to grow their talent within their ERG programs. WAY hosts quarterly events, which is why we're here today. These events are put on by our WAY committee members and corporate partners. We do every other event in person, so please join us in November for our next in-person event. More details will be shared at the end of this program. Again, if you'd like to learn more about the WAY initiative, please visit the Tempo website or reach out to the email that you see listed on the screen. And finally, a few housekeeping items for today's session. All of our attendees are muted with cameras disabled, but we do not want that to stop you from interacting with our speakers and contributing to this conversation. Please utilize the chat box to share thoughts and the Q&A function to submit questions to our speakers. We'll have reserve a bit of time at the end to answer some of the questions that are submitted by attendees. We also have a post-event opportunity to connect with fellow attendees and continue the conversation through our coffee connections, which I will share more about as well at the end of today's program. And now for the reason we're all here. Today's discussion is on the realness of the ERG leader burnout. Our world has shifted drastically over the last few years, and ERG leaders have been hit hard. Our speakers today are going to share their expertise and ideas on how to re-engage, retain, and remain resilient through these transitional times. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers this evening. Unfortunately, due to a family emergency, Marcy Harris-Schwartz is unable to join, but we are pleased to have Heather De La Luz fill in on behalf of Marcy. Heather is a managing director at BDO, and in addition to her day job overseeing tax integration, project management, and onboarding, Heather is a long-standing local office leader for BDO's Women Inclusion ERG. In addition, Heather is one of the firm's regional leaders for our ERG, where she supports the leaders of roughly 16 local offices. Therefore, she offers a unique perspective of not only being an ERG leader herself, but also as a leader of leaders. Dr. Julie Unite is trained as an industrial and organizational psychologist. Julie's experience has focused on assessment, succession planning, cultural transformation in organizations, and coaching for individuals and teams. Julie draws from a background in education and counseling psychology and extensive one-on-one consulting experience to provide clients with successful ways to deal with workplace issues. And our moderator this evening is Alicia Kaiser. Alicia is a vice president of human resources at M3 Insurance. Her role is to facilitate the workflow of M3's human resource department, including focusing on strategic HR initiatives, talent management and development, comp and benefits, and employee relations. Alicia is a member of Tempo and also sits on the WAY committee. Please join me in welcoming these three women for today's session. And ladies, I invite you to unmute and turn on your cameras.
Hello. Well, thank you so much for those intros, Jenna, and we are really looking forward to getting into it. So I'm excited for you all to hear from both Heather and Julie. And really let's just let's get into it. So we're talking about a lot of different things today, but wanted to start with maybe one of the most frequently written about and discussed topics of late, which is burnout. And so the first question I really wanted to pose to our two panelists is what, from your perspective, in areas of expertise, are the big warning signs for burnout and will allow us to recognize it in ourselves and others that we lead early on. And maybe Julie, if I could just start with you, and then Heather, feel free to chime in after.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think it's a very, it's a hot topic at the moment. The amount of times I've heard burnout, resilience, retention, talent war, all of those things that are being talked about at the moment. It's a very real topic at the moment. So I think it's a great place for us to start. So I'm a business psychologist. So I tend to look at burnout and resilience and all of these things sort of as a psychologist, and I'm thinking about how it plays out in behavior. And I also think about it in terms of, what are my people coming to me saying that they're experiencing? And I'm also finding that burnout and the things that people are talking about I'm hearing it a lot at the moment. So people tend to say to me things like, I'm just feeling really overwhelmed at the moment. There's just so much going on. Whenever I, open my calendar on a Monday morning, it's just full. I have meetings all day long. I don't have enough time to sort of stop and do some work and kind of dive in and do some of the sort of not busy work. And there's just this feeling of there's just too much. There's not enough hours in the day and I can't get it all done. So that's really, when I start hearing those kinds of conversations and people start saying that, that's when my, brain starts going, oh, let's see what's happening. And then the other thing that I hear people saying that start getting me to think about burnout is they have a really short fuse and they just haven't got that patience. They haven't got that kind of just, let's take a breath. Let's kind of think about this situation a little bit more. They go from 0 to 100 in a second. And that to me is also one of those signs of, you're not able to moderate, or you're not able to kind of manage the emotions as effectively as we can when we've got a bit more time and we're not feeling burnt out or going down that road. And then the other thing that I also see is kind of an apathy that some people can come to work with. So they sort of start losing the joy. They start losing the kind of, why do I do the work that I do? Why am I an ERG leader? Why do I want to be doing these things? That joy, that interest, that passion for what we do kind of gets lost, and everyone just sort of, there's just not a lot of energy or emotion. And then the other sort of things that people say to me when I know that they're heading down that burnout road is they just kind of stop listening to their instincts. They don't really have that little voice in the back of their head that says, you shouldn't really do that. They kind of go into fight flight mode and don't really think about what they should be doing or what they shouldn't be doing. So for me, those are some of the key indicators or the sort of stories that I get told from people. And those are the warning signs for me when I start hearing about burnout. But maybe I'll pause for a second, Alicia. Those are the sorts of things you hear. Heather, does that kind of ring true with what you're hearing from people at the moment?
Yeah, certainly. It's interesting that you went to the fight or flight comment, because we hear that often, and that's a topic of conversation that we've just even been having in the last few months. I think people get to the fight or flight mode, but they don't identify it or know that they're in that mode. So it creates this feeling of, I can't move forward, but I don't know why. There's something wrong with me, and I don't know how to make a decision. And so it's that almost like lethargic way of looking at it, where it's kind of fight, flight, and freeze. And people just kind of let life overtake them, and you get back into then, why am I doing what I'm doing? You're not asking yourself those questions every day. You're sort of just letting life pass you by. So the fight, flight, freeze has been a huge topic of conversation recently in our organization.
Yeah. Alicia,
I was just going to say, I so appreciate your comments, because I think when you think about burnout, I think we all think about this huge event, where it's very obvious and you're just totally breaking down. But the types of examples and stories that you both just shared are things that I think we probably see and experience every day from our teams. So anyway, I appreciate that. And I think those are super practical examples. So anything else on the burnout topic before we kind of move on?
Well, I really like what you just said, because the thing about burnout is, in my head, it's a really insidious process, and you don't realize you're burnt out until it's almost too late sometimes, which is kind of sad. And the problem with burnout is that when you get to that point, it takes a lot to come back. Now, don't sort of get negative about that, but you really have to work then at managing schedules and doing the gut checks and checking in with yourself to kind of get yourself out of that process and out of that burnout phase. So I think you're spot on, Alicia. You want to be doing those checks often so that you don't get down that road too far.
And we could probably have a whole nother session on then what do you do to proactively prevent that. But I think for today, just understanding how to identify that early on in ourselves and others is helpful, so we can, intervene where it makes sense.
Yeah.
So shifting a little bit more to the ERG leader topic, I'm curious to hear from both of you, from your different perspectives. How has the landscape with, in and about ERGs evolved and changed over the last few years? And really, Julie, I know you're not, necessarily involved with ERGs regularly, but even just women in business in general. I think about all that's happened, through the pandemic, and how our ERG internally at M3 has changed and evolved. So I'm just really, looking forward to hear from you two on your perspective here. Heather, do you mind kind of starting on this one?
Sure, absolutely. So as Jenna mentioned in the introductions, I am a regional leader for our women's initiative here at BDO, and also a local office champion. And within BDO, our groups, our ERG groups, kind of all work together to work towards the same goal. So when I share these perspectives, I am speaking on behalf of sort of the women's inclusion side of things, but it's very aligned with our ERG groups as a whole. So, and because I do lead ERG leaders through my regional role, I have certainly struggled with the tension I felt between providing support that the women have desperately needed for the past few years, and being realistic about the capacity of our ERG leaders, especially those that are women and parents. We've definitely pulled back quite a bit on our expectations surrounding activities and programming within our women's inclusion ERG, and it was the right thing to do. It's definitely made it more complicated now, though, to get that momentum back, because we were so used to minimizing the activities that we were doing, going back to virtual events, and sort of getting that energy back to in-person programming, driving relationships, providing networking opportunities has proven to be a little bit difficult. However, when shifting to the virtual setting, it's opened up the possibilities of connecting across geographies. So we've definitely been able to see many more regional and firm-wide events, which has created a feeling of camaraderie that is different. And it also helps rely on fewer ERG leaders needing to hold responsibilities. So you have the ability to sort of divide and conquer, as long as you're aligning with the overall priorities of the organization and driving your programming along the lines of those priorities. With logistics being much easier in a virtual setting, we've had access to different experts and speakers outside of the organization, which has been an added bonus. And we've been able to expand our reach. There's been a lot of energy behind connecting virtually across our geographies.
So out of curiosity, Heather and Alicia, because this isn't as, I'm not as familiar with this space, do you think with all the social issues and all the context effects that are happening at the moment, that there's more of a call and a more of an importance placed on the ERGs in organizations? Because that's kind of the experience and what I'm seeing in organizations, how important those groups are and how leadership is taking them more seriously. Is that kind of what you guys are seeing? And maybe I'm jumping around here on the questions, but.
No, I think that's a great observation. And we have absolutely seen that happen, Julie, at least at M3. And I think, going back to like the heart of COVID and everybody being kind of stuck at home, I think with a lot of the women carrying the weight of doing the schooling for kids and, the work, their normal day job, are a lot of the rest of the organization was looking to these ERG leaders to tell them, like, what do you need from us? Can you please help us lead through this time? Because you know better than we do about the struggles that, all these team members are experiencing. And I think there was also, we saw got a lot of recognition. The women of our organization got a lot of pats on the back and recognition, because I think our male counterparts saw how hard people were working at home with families, but also at work to kind of keep up and lead through a lot of this. So I think that's a really great observation and question, because while I think the women, at least of M3, were really excited to lean into that and excited to provide that expertise, it also can become exhausting and create, burnout in itself, which is why I think we're here today.
Yeah.
I was just going to chime in to say that's definitely been our experience as well. A little bit different aspect of it, but it's been something that's a huge topic of recruiting. And it's been something that's become expected of an organization. Do you have these different types of groups? How can I plug in? How can I find other people like me or that have similar passions than me? When we're on campus or we're talking to new hires that we're recruiting to join the firm, that is one of the first questions they ask, and they're asking it more frequently. How can I get plugged in? What do you have available for me? So we unfortunately, even though it's a struggle due to burnout and people, doing more than just their day jobs by being these ERG leaders, it's become both expected and a huge selling point for those that are looking to join the organization, because it's something that they're looking for and quite frankly expecting at this point in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Julie, has there been anything, notable that you've seen over the last couple of years, maybe not specific to ERG leaders or ERGs, but just women leaders in business, folks that you coach, just different signs or just different things that you're working through relative to prior to maybe, 2019 or something like that?
I mean,
or has it just been like burnout just with a different application, right? So I just didn't know if there are nuances to this type of things that folks are experiencing around burnout, or these are kind of the same things that you've always coached on as it relates to resilience, just under a different application.
No, I think the quantity of people who are experiencing burnout is increasing, and it's got a little bit more limelight now. So we are more comfortable to say, maybe I'm burnt out. And so there's a label put on it, whereas maybe there wasn't as much of a clear label put on it before. So I think in that sense, it's definitely very, very present, and it's just more obvious now and it's more known. That kind of answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. So, I guess, as you think about, and you touched on this a little bit already, but as an ERG leader, many times you're a small team, or it's not your day job, right? It's something that you do in addition to your normal role, like Heather. And so you have all of the responsibility there with the responsibility from, your normal job. So can you talk a little bit about that and how we navigate through that and how we support ERG leaders in navigating through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, I think there's a huge need to acknowledge that it is a challenge and not just like actually call it what it is and call it out, because I think so often things like this bubble up and leadership sort of either waits for the noise to subside or assumes that just more resources in due time will fix the issue. And I'm BDO, very similar to many organizations that I are likely on this call. There's just not more resources. There's not necessarily more bodies to put at something, maybe not the funding for it. While they want to make it a priority, there's not always the backing of the resources behind it. So it's not like, next year these ERGs are just going to grow and receive all the resources in the world and programming is going to expand. I think it's going to continue to stay a challenge just as organizations sort of figure out where their priorities are. And then that coupled with what we're talking about today, which is that burnout's at an all-time high, resources just magically aren't appearing out of nowhere to fight this reality. So a few thoughts on ways to navigate this and different things we've tried over the past few years. And just changing our programming, I think our focus and how we're aligning with the organization. One is to clearly define what ERGs are aiming to accomplish and also at the same time, keep it realistic. So for us, ERGs really specifically move the needle in the areas of inclusion and belonging, I would say more so than diversity and equity. So those are sort of the focus areas that we've been leaning into here at BDO. I would say the other few things too are encourage ERG leaders to consider the what's in it for me. What skills do they want to gain? Who do they want to network with? How could this role benefit them? And then make that the priority. So in order to get people to step up to be leaders, you're really personalizing their leadership journey by painting that picture for them of what's in it for you and really what are you going to get out of this that's important to you. And then one of the really big things too that has made a huge difference in our programming is quality over quantity. So I'm sure this goes without saying, but it's easy to forget that it's always better to host fewer events that have a real impact than too many things or something every month. This has made a huge impact on our programming. And events are becoming more widely attended and there's more energy behind them because it's fewer focused events that have a big impact rather than just doing something to check a box. And really, we just held summits this past summer locally in each of our 64 offices throughout the US. And a huge theme we've seen recently, specifically with women leaders across the country, are the themes of mentorship and allyship and awareness. So throughout those summits, those are the prevalent themes that have come up. And really what it kind of goes around to is the importance of relationships, the importance of mentorships and creating awareness through allyship. And so much of our focus the remainder of this year will be based on those themes. Part of that summit, it was interesting, a recent study that they told us during the summits was that if an individual can find something that they enjoy doing just for 20% of their work week, so finding something that brings that person joy for 20% of their work week, they're so much more likely to stay at their current employer. And so for us, a lot of the focus on the retention and the programming has been related to like helping individuals find their why and their passion. And much of that's been done through our ERGs. So quality over quantity, defining what we're accomplishing and aligning that with the overall mission of the organization. And then just bringing the purpose to leaders and sort of making that leadership journey personal for them.
I love that, especially, we've been working really hard at M3 to really define what we're here to do, what are our goals, and how does that align with the organization goals. And I absolutely agree with you. I think that really helps prioritize and hone in on what's really important. Julie, maybe to ask a similar question, but maybe in a different way, can you share some insight with us on how to help folks navigate through conflicting priorities, right? So that we don't stall the progress that we're making in our ERGs. I'm sure that's something that you coach on frequently.
Yeah, I was just wanting, I really love what Heather said, because she was looking at it from the organizational perspective and then linking it to what Alicia just said. I look at it in terms of how the individual can sort of navigate through some of those burnout issues and conflicting priorities, which we see all the time. And as I was thinking about this, I think some people set boundaries really, really well, and then some people don't. And the ones that set boundaries well, they carve out time. They don't feel guilty about carving out time. They don't feel guilty about switching off. They don't feel guilty about finding ways to recharge. And then the ones that don't tend to they sort of run themselves ragged, and they end up just, as I said, just getting burnt out. So I think the way that you can really help to manage the conflicting priorities is set really effective boundaries. Don't feel bad about doing that, and set goals. I mean, you said this before, Heather. Have realistic goals that help you to tackle a small piece at a time. You don't have to do it all in one hit. Set small goals, bite-sized chunks, and you'd be really amazed at how slowly that effort and all the little things you have to do for you as an ERG leader will add up, if you're trying to put an event on, or if you're trying to do any of those sorts of things. But if you try to leave it all to the last minute or tackle it all at once, it's not going to be as effective. And then I think the other really important thing is you have to ask for help, and you have to use the things that you just said, Heather, in terms of how do you find meaning again, and how do you find purpose again, and recruit people around you to help. And take little bits of the work and the responsibilities so that you don't feel as pressured and as kind of overwhelmed with all the different things that you have to do in that space to make an event happen, or to do any of the things that you have to do. And try not to be perfectionistic as well. We can't be amazing. We have to let go a little bit, and 80% sometimes is enough. So keeping all of those little things kind of going around in your head is probably some of the best pieces of insight that I could provide.
I think that's such practical insight. Thank you, Julie. And when I think about ERG leaders, at least from my experience, you have all the ERG members looking up to you to set the tone for, how they're leading in their respective areas throughout the organization, and to remember those things, and to lead by example by practicing what you just outlined. Man, what a huge impact I think that could make across, an organization, large or small. I think that's super practical. Thank you. Anything else on that?
I was just going to mention, it's interesting, Julie, you talked about sort of the kind of defining boundaries and potentially the guilt that can be brought on by saying yes, right, and not setting those boundaries. Something that I think aligns well, that while I was preparing for this, one of the things that I found is there was a study done that 54% of working moms said they felt like they could not give 100% at work because they were balancing work and parenting responsibilities. And I think so often, certainly from a woman's point of view, is like, if you can't give 100% of at work, or maybe even more than that, then that feeling of guilt settles in. And that's just one of the foundations of then that burnout starting. And so from an individual point of view, after that, it just starts to compound and layer. And I think so often we try to say, do what you can with what you have at that point in time. But we often forget that when we're trying to potentially be perfectionists or conquer the world all at once. So.
Yeah, spot on.
Well said. I think certainly something that I hear frequently as well. So, I mean, we've talked a lot about all that sits on the plate of ERG leaders. Heather, maybe you could start and comment about, what do you do at BDO to retain ERG leaders? Maybe best practices around that, and best practices around governance, because I do think that the governance also can lead into retention. So can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So sort of going back to some of those, and again, I'm thinking of this more from the organizational perspective. So kind of going back to like quality over quantity, finding kind of aligning passion with purpose and leadership opportunities. There's a little, let's dig into that a little bit more for some tactical best practices. So one of them is realistic expectations. So more often than not, ERG leaders are doing this over and above their day jobs. And you can't expect to hold them accountable in the same way you would your direct reports. So kind of thinking through that and thinking through what's the highest and best use you can get out of either the events that you're doing or the programming you're doing, knowing that this isn't something that they are doing day in and day out for their day jobs, and how can we sort of slowly but surely move the needle by providing quality programming through our ERG group. So more often than not, people sign up to be ERG leaders with good intentions, and they're doing the best they can given whatever their circumstances are at that point in time. But it certainly ebbs and flows just like life, and things can certainly get in the way often. So as a regional leader, I check in often with my leaders to understand how I can support them. We also suggest that our ERG leaders, so if we say we have, a women's inclusion leader, that they have a small committee with them to sort of help drive that programming, then they can divide and conquer. And it's very helpful in reducing burnout in their role. It also helps with idea sharing. So just sort of another sounding board that sort of understands what our goals are, and they're all working together to achieve those goals. And it's sort of, just kind of a sounding board for that ERG leader. We do heavily focus, even though it's not a huge part of, say, the ERG leader's compensation or promotion, we do heavily focus on reward and recognition for taking on the role. So that could be small thank yous, swag items. Everybody loves, a free water bottle or whatever it may be. Thank you emails, professional development opportunities, networking and mentoring connections. With our performance cycle, we advertise the ERG leaders and their accomplishments during our annual review process. So it's not the only factor in their promotion cycle. And again, it's certainly not, they're not compensated on it, but it helps show that the professional is going above and beyond for the betterment of the organization. And we do that heavy lifting for them by essentially creating a scorecard that sort of highlights all of their accomplishments during the year and everything they did to move the needle forward in conjunction with our ERG goals. And then the other thing is just providing as many support mechanisms as we can to make the load lighter. One of the huge wins that we had this year was a pre-allocated budget, which is kind of an interesting story and a huge win for our organization. Prior to this year, each leader had to go to their managing partner to get funds allocated on an annual basis. So, if we have a pride leader, a women's inclusion leader, a multicultural leader, each leader individually is going to one person to allocate funds for their programming. And it almost felt like whatever the managing partner at that point in time had on their mind, that's what they sort of allocated those funds to. And so Marcy, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, she was a huge advocate in getting this change for the organization. But she basically got dollars preloaded into the budget for office-wide events. So the budgets are available on a local office level, but across ERG groups. And it's for each office. So the ERG leaders then have to work together to plan focused events that align with our goals. So again, instead of quantity, where we're just, not talking with each other and not sort of driving a calendar that makes sense and doing this planning together, instead we have to work together to ensure that we're creating alignment in the overall organizational goals to be able to spend those funds together, and we're not having to sort of go to bat individually. And then just small things. I mean, we create activity toolkits that kind of provide a guidebook of what the activity could entail. Email templates, it makes it easy to copy paste for different newsletters like Women's History Month or Pride Month. We also do national webinars and activities. And so this is a lot easier with a virtual environment. So instead of having 64 offices recreate the wheel, you can just host one event with a speaker, and it has just as large of an impact, if not more, because you have a lot of energy around one event. So, and that's also really brought allowed firm leadership to attend those events, be more visible throughout the organization because they can connect with more people in a virtual setting. So it's really transformed. It's been a lot of heavy lifting, but if we have the infrastructure like we've done to create the environment that we have for the ERG leaders, they just have so much support behind them to really help them with that heavy lifting.
I think those are really a lot and really great tips. And I totally agree with you. Sometimes really just simple things like, brand PowerPoint decks so that people don't have to create that stuff from scratch can be super, helpful. One of the questions that came in through the chat was around best practices in compensating ERG leader roles. And Heather, you touched on this a little bit. You touched on it already in terms of how you guys handle it. I would say, just to share from my perspective, what we do and what I've seen in other organizations as I networked with people in building out M3's women's BRG, as we call it, was very similar to what you talked about at BDO. It's not, folks weren't paid, separately in any way for their work as a leader of an ERG, but rather it was taken into consideration with performance, promotions, and things like that. So I just wanted to call that out and answer whoever submitted that question. I'm sure there are other methods out there from a compensation perspective, but at least from, it sounds like what both Heather and I have seen, it's not common practice to compensate. And many times it's someone who has, another role in addition to their ERG leader role. Heather, I wanted to ask you, do you guys do anything around, setting expectations or onboarding folks who are stepping into ERG leadership roles?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And if you don't mind, before I answer that, I was just going to add something to the compensation too. It just depends on the individual. Sometimes it can be seen as something really fun. Other times it can be seen as something that's, not an extra thing. But pre-COVID, we used to do regional summits. And so we would fly, in the central region, everybody to Chicago, and they'd spend a few nights downtown, and we'd wine and dine them. And then just to show some appreciation for everything that they do. And then as part of the planning summit, we would have a professional development speaker come in. So previously we had an executive coach come in. So they get sort of that extra little, something fun to look forward to, travel. While it may not be a spot bonus or something like that, it is that extra little like professional development, social, travel atmosphere. I do think there's potentially some room in organizations, but you'd have to have very specific goals tied to it. And likely, in a BDO setting, we're all accountants, so it would be very numbers wise. But if moving the needle, like incentivizing leaders' compensation by moving the needle X%. So maybe it's more women in board positions. And if we can find, if some specific leaders have a way of moving that needle, then compensating them with a spot bonus. But yeah, in general, like you mentioned, it's more of the recognition, and then where we can, that extra thank you. So that's just the comment there.
And I'll add that from the psychology perspective, the fact that you are recognizing people in so many different ways is really, really effective, because not everyone's going to want to go on a social event, but some people will love getting a one-on-one sort of comment or appreciation from their leader or from someone higher up in the organization. So I love how you're tackling it from so many different perspectives. So people are going to get their buckets filled, even if it can't be through money or sort of a financial compensation. So I think that's really, really clever. Yeah.
And I was going to mention this at one point, but it kind of aligns, so I'll mention it now too before I answer the question, although Alicia, you'll have to remind me since I went on a tangent. We've also seen recently, which is very interesting, just because it's post-pandemic, I think, but more often than not, people aren't motivated by money. They're motivated by the opportunity for opportunities and for relationships. So that's a big thing we've seen is how can we create more finding that meaning and helping people find their why, that 20% that we talked about. And more often than not, it's through relationships and opportunities than just an extra, gift card or spot bonus. So that's good. Because I think that provides some relief to leaders who are trying to, motivate people without perhaps extra funding. So.
I think that's a great add-on. And to remind you about my question, I asked about onboarding, like setting expectations, onboarding. I know that's something that we've, just recently started to kind of double down on, because people, a lot of times we find are afraid to raise their hand for an ERG leadership role because of not understanding what it would all entail and the commitment. So just kind of curious what you all do.
Yeah, so I think that's really important too, just upfront, is sharing, what the time commitment looks like, if there's any travel involved, what that might look like. More often than not, we find leaders that we think would be good for the role, and then it's sort of like talking them into taking the leadership role. But as far as onboarding itself goes, we generally will provide the time commitment. There's not an official handbook, I would say, but generally speaking, we'll have a one-on-one call just to talk through what it means, what our goals are. We do every year, we set out our national goals for that year. So we do have a vision of what we're working towards, which is really nice. Each leader isn't responsible for creating that themselves, but what they are responsible for is sort of driving programming that works in the local office and sort of what that constituency looks like and feels like and how they can work together to drive that programming so that it all kind of aligns. So, and then yes, onboarding, but more so support just ongoing is getting them plugged in, and it's more just meetings, getting calls, getting them on board that way, and then helping them start to sort of draft their plan for the year. So we have templates on how to do effective programming, what effective events might look like. We have a survey that they can send out after the event, so they're not recreating that wheel. We introduce them to the office. If they want a committee behind them, we help find people to support them that way. So it's not anything really black and white, and there's not really a playbook behind, but it's more so driving that relationship, supporting them as they sort of get their feet wet. And then once they get to the sort of get into the position, then arming them with the templates, tools, where to charge their time, expenses, etc. So.
Julie, did you have something? I didn't know you were off mute. Okay. I did have another follow-up question. Sorry, Heather. Now I'm going to pepper you.
That's fine.
What about, do you have any expectations around how long someone needs to be in role or at your organization before they can take on a role like this? Because I know from you want people to be settled, but you also don't want to prohibit people, even if they've been with you for a short period of time, from leading in this way, especially if they would have, really great contributions.
Yeah. So generally speaking, we'd like them to be with the organization for 2 years. It is tough in public accounting just because we generally do see higher turnover. But if you're thinking about somebody who's sort of just beginning to work with the organization as, an intern or somebody right out of college, just getting them to sort of understand the ins and outs of what it means to be a professional first, and then sort of jumping into that leadership role. So more often than not, what we'll do is use those like committees or, sounding board, personal board of directors for the leaders to fill the position when the leader's ready to turn over. We like to see leaders turn over essentially every 5-ish years. We kind of know, we can get that feeling just because we connect with them often when they're themselves like, I've been doing this forever, I'm maybe onto a promotion and I need to focus elsewhere, or I feel like I need, new ideas and I want somebody younger and newer in the role. So we definitely see that, but we want somebody in the role that can really drive that programming, that energy, has that executive presence, that has been with the firm for a few years and is comfortable sort of taking the lead. And generally speaking, that comes with just professional experience as well. I will say too, one thing that's been interesting to me is, and I've had this conversation very recently, even like in a women's inclusion role, but you can be a leader without the title. So you can still be an ally for ERGs without being an ERG leader yourself. You can drive energy around the programming, invite your friends, be an ally, word of mouth advertising. You can do all that without having the actual title itself. And so just reminding people that like you don't need the ERG leadership title in order to drive a allyship towards ERGs. And that's just kind of one step in the leadership journey of starting to get involved, get plugged in. And then once you kind of understand what it's like to be a professional and plan events and be organized and that kind of thing, then taking it from there and stepping into the leadership role.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. And is your governance like super like formally documented and available and transparent, or are you kind of adapting as you go?
So we had been adapting as we went, but it's becoming more formal, which actually is a breath of fresh air because you're sort of all like you're rowing in the same direction. And us being accountants, like we want to know what our goals are and we want to surpass those goals and we want measurable goals behind that. So that's been really great. We like, for example, from a numbers standpoint, we are supposed to plan 2 to 3 events a year, and it's supposed to include 2 or more ERG groups for each event. So that's something that's very easy to track. With our surveys, we track attendance, how many people attended, what makeup of the attendees, gender wise or level or title. And so we publish all of that. And part of that too is to help make up that scorecard at the end of the year to really highlight the leaders' involvement. We're doing all that legwork for them throughout the year by doing those surveys and documenting it so that at the end of the year, it's really easy to pull together. And then for the first time recently, the firm itself published a DE&I report that got a lot of press externally as well. And so that's been really cool to see just the strides we've made. I mean, we still have a long way to go, and certainly in the accounting industry, from like a women partner perspective, women board members perspective, we have a long way to go, but we've been able to really celebrate our successes by documenting all that and then being able to publish it externally.
That's great. Yeah, I would double down on that. So, at M3, we've been pretty diligent about our governance, which helps because, one, I think it makes it a little less intimidating to get involved when okay, my term is only 2 years and I can throw my name in the hat again, but at least I have an out if I'm ready to let someone else take the reins. And so I would totally agree with your comments there. So I wanted to maybe ask and get a little bit more tactical in our conversation about, steps that we can take and, books that we can read, podcasts that we can listen to, and just other kind of action items that ERG leaders can take to help build resiliency, re-engagement, and retention. So Julie, maybe we'll start with you. I think you talked about some really, nice, practical, tactical things early on, but any other recommendations for the group here?
Yeah, and I go to the individual again of how can I help an individual, because a lot of what I do is coaching and helping individuals when they get to this burnout place of how do I dig myself out of this? What practical tips or strategies do I put in place so that I can remain out of the burnout zone? And for me, building resilience is a huge piece of that. And my sort of sense is that if you've got strong resilience, then that then cascades down into, I feel engaged, I want to stay doing what I'm doing. So the core of it for me is resilience. And so the sort of building blocks that I help people think about when they're trying to build their resilience, there's a couple of different things, and Alicia's sort of been through some of these and then heard me work on with their teams on some of these things. The sort of first tip that I would tell people is you really need to know yourself. You need to know what makes you tick. You need to know what you're really good at, because when you know what you're good at, you can gain energy and confidence through those things. And that's an amazing way, it's a really good mechanism to make sure that you keep that energy and it builds that resilience. But equally, you need to know your blind spots. You need to know the things that you don't do so well. And if you can look at yourself in the mirror and say, I'm good at this, but I'm not good at this, it just sets you up for success in such a more positive way. Because when you know what you don't do well, you can get the right support. You can make sure that you're really ready for some of those tough situations that you go into, so you don't fail as easily or as blindly as you can. So know yourself, be an excellent observer of yourself, and be a good self-critic. And the other thing that I always suggest to people is come up with really good ways to recharge. So tip number 2 is, find your way to recharge. And this seems like the most simple thing in the world to do, but people really struggle to do it. And for recharging can be any sort of different thing. It can be a yoga class. It can be, reading a book, and it can take a long time. It can take an hour, 2 hours. It can be the whole weekend, or it can be really, really simple things in the day. It's funny, when I work with people, we come up with things that they can do in their day that gives them just sort of 10, 15, 20 minutes of a task that retracks their brain into doing something completely different. And just by doing that and giving your brain a 20-minute break or even a 10-minute break, that's your brain's way of recharging, and that builds the resilience and it builds your ability to kind of keep going. And everybody has different ways of doing that. I had my husband, for example, goes and looks at Duolingo and spends 20 minutes learning Spanish. I have another client who has a bath in the middle of the day, because for them, that's really restorative. And I mean, that sounds, really unique, but everybody's going to find their thing that they can tap into to give their brain a break, because that really helps them to stay strong, stay positive, stay upbeat, because often we don't have a lot of time. So find your ways to recharge. They can be big, they can be small, but I think that's a really, really important piece. Another one that I always say to people is, build your village. And you've talked about this, Heather, a couple of times already, in terms of having a committee of people that can help you and support you. We can't do it alone. We have to have the help. Don't be afraid of getting the help. And also don't be afraid of having those friends or mentors or coaches or anybody who can tell you when you're kind of losing it and when you're getting a little bit frazzled, and they can say, I'm noticing you're just a bit, your fuse is really short. And those are the people that help you go, oh, yeah, they're right. I have to stop. I've got to go and do a gym class. I've got to go and do something that's going to help me recharge. So find your support, build your village, because those are the foundations of staying resilient. And when we have that resilience, we can weather the storm of all the challenges that we've been talking about in a much more effective way. So those are kind of 3 tips. I mean, they seem really simple, but sometimes that's all it is just knowing yourself really well, find ways to recharge, and then get your support, get feedback, get help, and don't be afraid of doing that. So those are some tips that I work with people on. I'd love to hear any of your tips and any questions that you might have about that.
I love those, Julie. One time I did a resilience seminar or something, and the instructor, had us they had a timeline throughout the day from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. And, it was like a line, and they said, all right, draw kind of it will kind of look like a roller coaster. When you're above the line, that's when you have like a high energy level and you're engaged. And when you're below the line, that's when your energy level is low. Plot it throughout the day. And, for me, my energy level was high from like 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. when my kids were still sleeping. And then when I got to work, it just tank. And the point was, look at your energy level, look at your engagement level throughout the day. You can handle it, and you do handle it. But think about how much better you could be if you were finding ways to recharge throughout the day so that your energy level maybe dipped but came back up. And so I don't know, maybe I'll have to try the bath thing or something else, but I think those are great tips.
Yeah.
Heather, anything that you have that you want to comment on there?
Sure. Yeah, I have a few things, and they're very similar to Julie's, which is interesting because she's coming at this from the psychology perspective. But I do think you have a point, Alicia, of finding your peak times, right? Because so often I think when we get to that burnout phase, that's where we get into the life just passes me by, poor me, I don't know how to get out of this type thing. And it becomes this tornado of spinning. And you can get out of it if you have the right planning and the right mindset. But that feels like work in order to just get out of it and start thinking, okay, well, if I just remember, or if I just actually physically write down that timeline and identify it, then I have that tool to put in my toolkit going forward. But so often it's like, I'm already burnt out. I'm just going to freeze and stop where I am, and life's going to pass me by. And one day I'll get back to where I needed to go. So I love what you said. I need to take that tip for myself. I have a few thoughts on that. So one is kind of what Julie started off by saying, is just understanding first where your energy is so you can bring focus to what you're trying to achieve. And again, I'm coming at this from a professional in an organization who's an ERG leader and is trying to work towards goals. And so if I'm burnt out, I won't have the energy to go above and beyond. And so just knowing and being aware of that, where am I today? What are my ebbs and flows? Where do I need help? Where do I need to call in my personal board of directors? Who do I need to keep me honest? So thinking of, where's my energy? What ebbs and flows? And then when do I need that support system the most to sort of keep me honest and keep me going? The other thing that I've tried to do is and this may be a little bit selfish, but it's worked for me certainly, is aligning passion projects of mine with the company's ERG strategy. So one of my big passions is yoga. It keeps me sane. Without it, I'd be a basket case. And one of the big things that we're seeing for women is they want that inclusion, belonging, connection, restoration. And so actually tomorrow, in Holland, Michigan, which I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan, we're doing a women's yoga retreat, and BDO is sponsoring it. We have 30 women joining. They're paying for a full day. It's like 9 to 3, where we're going to somebody's cottage and we're doing yoga. We're practicing meditation. We're doing sort of like breath to movement. We're going to do some journaling. We're gonna create a joy list, and so then we can pull from that when we need it the most. But I'm super passionate about it, so this has been a really fun event for me to plan, and I know that the women in it are going to get so much out of it. So it's a win-win for me because I'm planning something that I want to attend, but it's also very fulfilling for me because I see how important it is for others. And it's not just me checking a box of, oh, yeah, we did this event. It was around mindfulness. Check the box. Now move on to the next thing. Send out the survey and get the numbers up. It's so much more than that. And when you can align what you're really passionate about with the things that you're involved in planning, it makes it not feel so hard. And you're having fun while you're doing it. And then I mentioned this earlier, just on the retention front, and we talked about that 20%. It's kind of thinking the one thing. What's one thing you can do to help someone else find their why? So it's ask your team what matters. Survey your audience. How can you begin to slowly move the needle by creating the grassroots initiative? You don't need a huge organizational policy change to help the bulk of the organization find their why, more often than not, it's through driving relationships. It's less about money and it's more, again, about relationships and opportunity. So, how can you help one individual find their why? That individual will then help somebody else find their why. And it just permeates throughout the organization. We found that companies with a strong sense of purpose and value-driven work, they have a culture that's more likely to experience lower rates of burnout. And much, like I said, much of it's related to relationships and less about compensation. For many, it's not necessarily about the money, but it's finding that purpose and then aligning that purpose with what they bring to the table and what their work is on a day-to-day basis. And then last but not least, just on a personal note for me, it's been writing out my joy list and deciding when I need a moment, like what's the one thing I can choose from that list. For me, I'm very regimented, not necessarily the most flexible individual. So I need to have a pre-written kind of toolbox that I can choose from. And it's easier for me to pull from that toolbox rather than recreating the wheel. Like once I identify that burnout and then trying to figure out what makes me happy and then do that thing just is so much extra work that if I just pull from, oh, these are the things that make you happy, just go do one of these. Like you already know this makes you happy. Just go for a walk or go for a hike. And the other huge thing, like Julie mentioned, I mean, the bath during the middle of the day is very, very unique, like you said, but a huge thing is remembering, like, we're all people too. We're human, we're people, we're not robots chained to our desk 24/7. Doing something for yourself doesn't need to just happen either on weekends or outside of work. So for me, it's, decompressing by taking a walk between meetings, and it's helped me be so much more present with my teams because I'm not just going from one thing to the next and multitasking. I'm actually like, stop, get outside, go take a walk, get some fresh air, think about what you're going to be walking back into. And that just has helped me clear my mind. And more often than not, when I'm doing that walk outside, I just use my phone as sort of an electronic journal or notebook, if you will. And often I just write whatever's on the top of my mind. It's kind of one of those things where I just write it down, notice my thought, acknowledge the thought, and let it go. And it makes me feel lighter. I think when I'm not doing that at the end of the day, I get to, oh my gosh, I just carried the weight of the world on my shoulders. And now I have to go be a wife, be a mom, whatever that is. And it feels so overwhelming that if you can take those breaks throughout the day and sort of reconnect, recharge, and doesn't have to be hours, it can be a few minutes here or there. And if you can sneak it in, then you're not just being human and being yourself on nights and weekends, you're being everything you are during the day too. And I think that helps kind of drive that passion for what you do.
I love that. This is such a fun topic. And if you have any openings in your yoga retreat tomorrow, let me know. I don't, or if it's yeah. Julie, we can carpool.
Yeah,
I do. So we do have time for a couple of questions from the group here. And I do have a number of them in my queue. So Heather and Julie, if you don't mind, I have a few questions I want to throw out there. The first one I want to bring up is, what are some ways to change business-wide perceptions of ERGs? For example, when people think they're ineffective, time-consuming, lack direction. I think I like this one because I do think it touches on, it can be difficult to be an ERG leader when there are perceptions like that out there. So from a retention perspective, an engagement perspective, I think this is an important question. So, Heather probably would look to you to comment, but maybe before you do, I can share, at M3, one of the things that we've started to do on this front is we do an annual, what do I call it? Like the annual impact report. So, at the end of the year, we do a report to the whole organization, and we record like a video with the presentation and talk about the work that was done throughout the year, highlight the folks that were involved in that work, and highlight the impact that made on the business in whatever way we can, whether that be anecdotally or quantify it. And we've been doing that over the last 2 years, which I think has really helped just from a, transparency and exposure perspective. And also from a recognition perspective. So Heather, I was trying to buy you some time to think about that question a little bit, but we'll throw it back to you if you can talk about BDO.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate it. So two perspectives here. One, I think is probably easier said than done, which is just going back to the basics. So going back to what is our goal? Why are we working to achieve that goal? And what's the one thing that we can do to slowly move the needle? A small, steady impact is going to have an overall bigger impact on the organization than trying to boil the ocean at once and not getting to where you thought you could be. I mean, it's impossible to boil the ocean. So why try that, right? Trying to go towards a small impact on events or programming that really matters and goes back to why. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you asking somebody to give the extra little bit? Go back to what are we trying to achieve? Why are we doing what we're doing? And let's make a small but steady change inch by inch. And then when we look back over the year, we can see the impact that we've created. That is one thing. I will say, just from my experience, I think this kind of goes along with the question a little bit, but it's an interesting observation. And one I bet a lot of companies struggle with. Alicia, yours may be the same, but also remembering that a lot of with these ERGs, you don't have to be that to support it. So for example, like oftentimes with the women's inclusion group, you don't have to be a woman to support women in the workplace. And it's that way with several of our different resource groups. And so a lot of it is about creating that awareness. And again, kind of going back to like, what's the one focus? What's the one way we can move the needle? And remembering you don't have to be all things to all people, but you also don't have to be that to support it. How can we work together to create that allyship? Working together to do a few things well, then I think avoids burnout, because you're not just being all things to all people, you're going back to what truly matters in the organization and to the people that are part of those groups and attending that programming.
I love it. So I guess one question that I would ask is, there's more of a governance question. Have you ever explored or tried a progressive leadership path for ERGs? The example was, like year 1 vice president, year 2 president, year 3 past president. Heather, can you talk about how you guys handle that?
Yeah, we haven't done it necessarily in those terms, although I really love that idea, and I'm going to steal it from whoever wrote that in the chat. So thanks for that. It's more so it's definitely, I would say, maybe more grassroots, if you will, than something super official. Whereas we really start more with somebody who's passionate about it, maybe is that on that committee, and then becomes a leader in their local office, and then would potentially move to regional leader. So it's more of not necessarily grooming somebody from vice president into president, but more of the committee. Do you have a passion for helping us drive programming? And then if you do, let's get your feet wet through that and then look to be a leader in a few years. Generally speaking, our regional leaders are pulled from our local leaders. And it's somebody who's typically very involved. Now, with that being said, a different sort of take on this, and something that's been pretty successful in our organization, is just finding other opportunities to still get people involved. So we created a few councils as well at the national level. One is called an early career council, and one's called a mid-career council. And they're the ones that help sort of figure out what our overall national goals are that we want to cascade down to the offices. They also help us create those email templates, the activity toolkits. I would say they're probably more of our governance body, and they're pulled from local leaders, but then that way there's different options for different people depending on the phase of life that they're in. So perhaps maybe early on in your career, you start off with just, being on a committee or being in that early career council, then maybe you go be a local office leader. From there, you move up to mid-career council. So it's maybe less of a linear move up, and more of let's provide as many opportunities as we can for women and men. We started a male ally as well. So every office typically will have a male ally that will help drive programming too for the women's inclusion groups. And that's kind of what we've seen within women's inclusion itself, but maybe not as linear, but more broad opportunities to get involved. But I like the idea. It helps drive those leadership skills and that executive presence early on.
And I would say at M3, we do actually have chairs and like a vice chair, and that helps with, again, the comfort level and engagement. So it's not like you have to jump into a role. You have some time, you have a year to shadow someone who's doing or like leading in that capacity. And that has worked really well for us and something that we built into the governance. So I have a couple of, well, maybe we have time for one other question. I know Jenna has some closing comments, but there was a question about, tools that this group recommends when starting an ERG in a company that doesn't currently have one. So I don't know, Heather, if you have recommendations there, or Julie, if there are, maybe considerations or things to think about from your perspective to really kind of starting off on the right foot so that, folks are set up for success. Just some thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, I can go first. And then Julie, if you want to give any comments, just overall or from the individual level. I will say I had have the great benefit of joining BDO. I joined about 10 years ago, and the women's inclusion groups were very strong. So I sort of joined an infrastructure that already exists, but some thoughts that I have there is just more often than not, when sharing this with leadership, they know it's needed. People are calling for it. It's a topic of conversation in the workplace all over, regardless of the organization that you're in. So they know it, but more often than not, I think to get leadership to buy into it and potentially give resources towards it, show them the facts, right? I mean, there's so many studies out there, and specifically with women, women of color, different obstacles that we have to overcome in order to get the same, I guess, benefits as others in the workplace. And so there's certainly a lot of facts and figures around that. And then, just depending too on overall, specifically what resource groups you're looking for and what you're really looking to implement. But I think it starts with having the conversation, presenting the business case to your leadership, use the studies that are out there. You could also do a cost benefit analysis, like the cost of not doing this. Yes, there's the cost of doing it. Give you an example. I know all organizations are different in funding, but in general, our offices have anywhere between, say, $10,000 and $20,000 a year put towards their programming. I don't know really what scale that looks like in other companies, but I think it's sizable when we're looking at doing events, in our local offices. So you could also go with, here's the cost to do this, but here's the cost of not doing it. What is the cost of burnout, or the cost of not retaining our top talent, or the cost of somebody coming out of grad school and not joining our company because we don't have this programming, or the cost of lost business because we don't have the resources behind us. So kind of thinking through it from an executive business case perspective. And then I would say, if that's what you're passionate about and that's what you're going to present, then put your money where your mouth is, so to say, from a resource standpoint. So what are you going to do to back this up? What's the infrastructure you need? Is it, somebody that's sort of in charge, a national diversity or a diversity, equity, inclusion leader? Is it one leader sort of driving that strategy with your executive team? Like, what's the infrastructure you're looking for? And that doesn't really cost anything in some organizations. Ours is you're kind of doing double duty, it's above and beyond your day job. And that's why we got here to the topic today. But just what does that infrastructure look like? What are you willing to sort of help do to drive that programming? And what are your recommendations then? Once you get to the yes, how are you going to back that up with the infrastructure to build beyond that? And I'm sure there are groups on LinkedIn, groups like this, where once you get the energy to build that in your organization, you can look to, hey, do you have a template for this? Hey, where did you start? Hey, what toolkit did you use first? When we talk about finding meaning, what are some activities that you can use kind of around that to drive that? So, ask for the money or the funding or the resources. Don't be afraid to give that ask, but back it up with the facts. Say what you're going to do with those resources and how you would create the infrastructure around it. Like, help them get to a yes by not giving them a reason to say no. And then use your resources to figure out what other people are doing. Generally speaking, somebody's been there before or has a great idea that you haven't tapped into yet. And that's all free. Networking is free. Using your resources, Google, LinkedIn, that's all free. So take advantage of those around you. We all want to build each other up.
Thank you, Heather. And so I can maybe comment here too, because I had to start M3's Women's Business Resource Group, which was our first affinity group. And there was actually a conference in Chicago that I attended that was literally all around affinity groups, starting affinity groups. And that was a huge help to me in gathering my thoughts, because you got to hear from a lot of different organizations. And I kind of reflected on what would work well for our organization. There was a book that they gave out there, and I apologize, I was trying to Google it and I couldn't find it quickly, but there was a book that they gave out that also was like step-by-step on starting an affinity group, everything from the business case to the budget to the governance, which was a really great practical kind of handbook to getting some of that stuff off the ground. And Heather, to your point, the other thing that I had a lot of fun with was reaching out to organizations that had established affinity groups and learning from them in kind of the areas where we had offices. So just wanted to add that. Julie, any thoughts from your perspective on this topic?
I think Heather did a beautiful job of outlining the main pieces, and I would echo going to a leader with a plan. And this is what I think we should do is definitely the best way to do it. If you go to them and say, I want to build an affinity group or a set of affinity groups, they're gonna just say, well, great, that's a good idea. We've all got so much on our plates. But if you go to them with a plan and the resources and all those different pieces that you were talking about, I think you're going to have a much stronger reaction and a much easier opportunity for them to say yes.
Excellent. There was a question if I could follow up with the book and the conference I was referring to. I will certainly look for that and see if Kelsey from Tempo can help me with that follow-up. Absolutely, I'll do some research. I want to pause, and Jenna, I know you have some closing comments. I don't know how long those are going to take, so maybe want to throw it back to you at this point, but you can tell me if maybe we have time for more questions.
Yeah, so we have, my closing comments will probably take about 5-ish minutes.
Okay. I think there was really only one other question, and probably more governance, tactical. How does your company handle paying hourly team members for ERG participation? And so, Heather, I'm not sure if you have hourly team members. We don't really have hourly team members. We do have non-exempt team members. And for those folks, this is paid time. I mean, they're on the clock. They don't have to, do that on their own time. So I don't know, Heather, go ahead.
Yeah. So I can speak from, I guess, kind of both points of view. So for example, like tomorrow's retreat, all the people that are going we have both salaried and hourly employees. Tomorrow it's all salaried employees that are going. So it's sort of like a free day, if you will. They can, well, we have to charge our time as accountants, so they can hit their time to admin and they're not going to get yelled at for the productivity. It's been supported. Thankfully, we're also in an office that is super supportive. For the hourly employees, it is still supported, but generally speaking, that could put them at overtime. So they just have to go through an extra little piece of red tape, I would say, of requesting that they can go or getting that approved, because it would be above and beyond their normal day job. And generally that would put them into the overtime category. But more often than not, leadership is accepting of that and says yes. So generally speaking, for us, it's on an office by office kind of case by case basis. I don't think it's written overall policy, but more so like getting that acceptance before joining the event. Or more often than not, they're, even if they say yes, but you're not going to get paid for it, but BDO is still perhaps paying the fee to have them attend the event. So I think there's different ways that it can be handled, but generally speaking, it's on a case by case basis.
I think that's a really great question, because while it seems minor, I mean, for folks who are in those roles, that matters a lot. And so to be able to kind of outline that on the front end or make it accessible is a really big deal.
Yeah, and I think too, depending on overall, those that are thinking through like, okay, well, what would that policy look like, or what am I going to request? It's definitely important to think through all those sort of odds and ends. One thing I will say that's been really, really well received, maybe it'll make you all want to come join BDO, but every year we have what's called a day of recharge and reflection. I know there's a lot of companies that will do maybe the week of 4th of July off, or they've done the like mental health breaks and just things like that. We do a day of reflection and recharge. And it's a day that everybody in the whole organization shuts down. They give us an out of office that we can use, so we can just copy paste that. And then resources for that day of reflection and recharge. So, we can use it how we want, but more often than not, it's in the wake of, okay, use this as a time to really just disconnect. Maybe it's journal, maybe it's create that joy list, maybe it's go hiking with your family. Whatnot, but that's been really well received. Now, to get that approved, not sure how many hoops they had to jump through, but it's been a wonderful perk of the organization, and it's something that everybody looks forward to every year because they get to make it unique to what helps them, but it's supported by the organization, and that's for all employees regardless of employment status.
Beautiful. All right, Jenna, you ready?
I'm ready. Thank you all for your participation in tonight's event. A special thank you to our speakers, Heather and Julie, especially Heather, who filled in at the 11th hour, so really appreciate that. And to Alicia for moderating and all of her behind the scenes work to make today's session a reality. I personally thought it was really valuable when Heather spoke to aligning passion with purpose, and Julie's discussion about finding ways to recharge yourself, and not only finding ways to recharge, but to prioritize those. We hope that all of our attendees feel equipped to head back to their workplaces re-energized and ready to re-engage with their ERGs. Before we close, we invite you all to join us for our next Women's Affinity Alliance event hosted by EY on Wednesday, November 30th. Keep an eye out in your inboxes for more information once registration opens. We will also be sending out a post-event survey to all attendees today, so please look out for that in your inbox. We really appreciate the feedback, and hopefully you'll be able to complete this very short survey. I believe it's going to be posted in the link in the chat right now. So if you want to do it right now while I'm doing these closing remarks, please do. The responses are very valuable to us. And last but not least, our committee is really excited to bring back our Way Coffee Connections. We want the conversations to continue beyond this event. Since our attendees are not able to interact with one another because of the virtual nature, we strongly encourage everyone here today, whether you're a member or not, to sign up by using the QR code on the screen for a coffee connection. So coffee connections are random one-on-one pairings that allow you to connect with another attendee from today's session and dive deeper into the topic that we talked about. You don't have to meet for coffee. You can jump on a Zoom meeting. You can go for a walk. You can meet for drinks, you name it. But it's a great low commitment opportunity to meet with another ERG leader, work through some issues or opportunities for your ERG, and to expand your personal network. You'll have 1 week from today to sign up for the coffee connection, and then you'll receive an intro email, which will connect you with your match. A link to the coffee connection will also be in that email when we send out the post-event survey. So if you don't decide right now, you still have time. Thank you again for joining us today. Enjoy your evenings.